Crossroads, places of mystery, folklore, and the unknown. These intersections have long been the focus of eerie tales, where the veil between our world and something far darker seems unnervingly thin. Tonight, I'll share with you 4 chilling stories of encounters at crossroads that will make you think twice about where you stop at night. From mysterious figures to unexplainable whispers, these stories are sure to leave you questioning what might be lurking in the shadows. Happening number 1, the crossroads at midnight. Crossroads have long been shrouded in mystery and folklore. In many cultures, they're believed to be places where the supernatural crosses into the mortal realm. I never put much stock in those kinds of stories until I found myself at one, alone, in the dead of night. It was during my senior year of college. I had taken a road trip to visit an old friend in a small, rural town. The kind of place where the streets are deserted after 9 p.m. and everyone knows everyone else. I decided to leave late Sunday evening to avoid traffic, even though it meant driving through the night. The GPS took me on a route that cut through the backroads, avoiding highways entirely. The first couple of hours were uneventful, long stretches of dark, empty road with only my headlights piercing through the night. But then, around 1 a.m., my GPS glitched. It rerouted me to a narrower, older road that wasn't on any map I'd seen. The pavement was cracked, and the trees grew so close to the edges that their branches reached over the road like skeletal hands. But I figured it was just a shortcut and kept going. About 15 minutes later, I came to a crossroads. 4 paths converged in the middle of nowhere, with no signs or markers to indicate where they led. My GPS froze completely, refusing to load the next turn. I was completely alone, surrounded by thick woods on all sides, and the eerie stillness made my skin crawl. As I sat there trying to get the GPS to work, I noticed something strange. In the middle of the crossroads, there was a wooden post with a small, rusted metal box attached to it. Curious but cautious, I got out of the car to take a closer look. The box had no lock, just a latch that creaked when I opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, yellowed with age. Scrawled on it in shaky handwriting were the words, "Leave now, or stay and pay the price." Chills ran down my spine. It felt like some kind of prank, but there was no one around. I quickly got back into my car and tried to reverse, only to find that the road behind me was gone. I don't mean it was blocked or overgrown, I mean it wasn't there. The road I had just driven on was now a dense forest, as if it had never existed. Panic set in, and I decided to take one of the other roads at random, hoping it would lead me out. As I started driving, the feeling of being watched grew overwhelming. My rearview mirror showed nothing but darkness, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was following me. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, like a breeze brushing through the trees, but they grew louder, more insistent. They weren't coming from outside the car, they were inside. I slammed on the brakes, heart racing, and looked around. The whispers stopped, replaced by a knock on the passenger side window. I turned, and my blood ran cold. Standing just outside the window was a figure. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its outline was tall and impossibly thin. It didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, staring. I didn't wait to find out what it wanted. I floored the gas pedal and sped down the road, praying it would lead me back to civilization. The whispers returned, louder this time, echoing all around me. The road seemed endless, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. At one point, I swore I passed the same crossroads again, even though I hadn't turned back. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw a faint light ahead. It was a gas station, dimly lit but welcoming. I pulled in, shaking, and ran inside. The clerk looked up from the counter and froze when he saw me. Before I could say anything, he asked, "You came from the crossroads, didn't you?" I nodded, breathless, and he shook his head gravely. "You're lucky to be here. Not everyone makes it out." He wouldn't explain further, and I didn't press him. I just filled my tank and left, sticking to main roads for the rest of the drive. To this day, I avoid crossroads, especially at night. Whatever I encountered there wasn't human, and it wasn't friendly. And if you ever find yourself at a crossroads in the middle of nowhere, take my advice, don't stop. Just keep driving. Happening number 2, the bargain at the crossroads. Crossroads have always had a strange allure, a place where choices are made, and paths intersect, both literally and figuratively. This story happened to me last fall when I was driving through the Midwest. I was on a solo road trip, exploring rural America and its quiet beauty. What I didn't realize was how unsettling that quiet could become. It was my 3rd night on the road, and I had gotten lost after ignoring my GPS to explore a bit. The sun had long set, and the only light came from my car's headlights slicing through the darkness of endless fields. After driving for what felt like hours, I finally saw something ahead, a crossroads. There was nothing remarkable about it at first glance, 2 dirt roads intersecting in the middle of nowhere. What caught my attention, though, was the figure standing at the center. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall and thin, dressed in a black suit that seemed out of place for such a remote location. His face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but he stood perfectly still, as if waiting for something. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to turn around, but the logical side of my brain told me he might need help. Against my better judgment, I rolled down the window and called out, "Are you okay?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly raised a hand and pointed down one of the roads. It sent a chill down my spine. Something about his presence felt wrong, unnatural. I didn't want to drive past him, but staying there felt even worse. I chose the road he pointed to, hoping it would lead me back to civilization. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The man was gone. The road was narrow and lined with skeletal trees that seemed to close in on me the further I went. My radio, which had been playing softly, started to cut out, replaced by static. And then, over the static, I heard it, a voice. It was faint at first, barely distinguishable, but it grew louder. "You shouldn't have come this way." My heart raced. I tried to convince myself it was interference, maybe a nearby radio tower, but deep down, I knew better. The road twisted and turned in impossible ways, and soon I realized I wasn't alone. In the faint glow of my headlights, I began to see figures standing just off the road. They were barely visible, like shadows, but their shapes were human. Every time I looked directly at one, it disappeared, only to reappear closer the next time I blinked. Then, my car stalled. I was in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service, and those shadowy figures were still out there. Panic set in as I tried to restart the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. That's when I heard it, a soft knock on my window. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. The man in the black suit was there, standing inches from my window. His face was still obscured by the hat, but I could feel his gaze. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. Then, in a voice that seemed to echo in my head, he said, "You have a choice to make." I don't know what came over me, but I slammed my fist against the steering wheel and screamed, "What do you want?" The man tilted his head, as if amused, and gestured back toward the crossroads. Suddenly, my car roared to life. Without thinking, I floored the gas and sped down the road, not caring where it led as long as it was away from him. After what felt like hours, I saw the lights of a small town ahead. I pulled into a diner's parking lot, shaking and barely able to breathe. When I told the waitress what had happened, her face went pale. She told me stories of the Crossroads man, a figure said to offer deals to lost travelers, at a price. Those who refused often didn't make it out. I don't know if I made a deal that night or what he wanted from me. All I know is that I'll never take a deserted road to a crossroads again. Some paths aren't meant to be traveled, and some choices should never be made. Happening number 3, the Crossroads Ritual. Crossroads are infamous for being sites of old rituals, places where the veil between worlds is said to be thinner. Growing up, I never believed in those kinds of things, until one night in my early 20s when I found myself in the wrong place at the worst possible time. It was a summer evening, and I was driving back to my hometown after visiting a friend. The route was mostly empty highways and rural roads, and I enjoyed the solitude. but as I neared a particularly remote area, my phone buzzed with a notification. My GPS rerouted due to construction ahead, taking me on an unfamiliar detour. The new path led me deep into the countryside. The further I drove, the more isolated it felt. The road narrowed, the trees grew denser, and the darkness seemed to swallow my headlights. After about 20 minutes, I reached a crossroads. There was something strange about this intersection. The area around it was unusually open, with no trees or bushes for several yards. In the moonlight, I could see faint, burned patches of grass forming a circle at the center of the crossroads. As I slowed down to decide which direction to take, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. 3 figures emerged from the tree line, walking toward the center of the crossroads. They wore long, dark cloaks that dragged on the ground, and their faces were obscured by hoods. My heart started pounding. This wasn't something you just stumbled upon. I turned off my headlights, hoping they wouldn't notice me. The 3 figures formed a triangle around the burned patch of grass and began to chant. Their voices were low and rhythmic, like an ancient hymn, though I couldn't make out the words. One of them lit a lantern, casting an eerie glow over the scene. I didn't know what to do. If I drove away, my headlights might draw their attention. If I stayed, who knew what I might witness, or what might happen to me if they saw me? Then I heard it. A deep, guttural sound echoed from somewhere in the darkness. It wasn't an animal. I've never heard anything like it before or since. The figures didn't react, they just kept chanting, as if they were summoning something. Suddenly, the air grew colder. My breath fogged up the windshield, even though it was the middle of summer. And then I saw it, a shape emerging from the shadows. It was massive, its form shrouded in darkness, but I could make out long, twisted limbs and glowing red eyes. The chanting grew louder, almost frantic, as the thing stepped into the burned circle. I couldn't stay any longer. Whatever was happening there, I wanted no part of it. I turned my car around as quietly as possible and drove back the way I came. As I sped down the road, my rearview mirror showed the figures still chanting, the monstrous shape looming over them. I didn't look back again. When I finally made it to the main highway, I pulled over and tried to catch my breath. My hands were shaking, and my mind was racing. What had I just seen? A cult ritual? Something supernatural? I told a friend about it the next day, but they brushed it off as my imagination. Still, I couldn't shake the memory of those glowing eyes and the unnatural cold. If you ever find yourself driving through the countryside at night, beware of crossroads. They're not just intersections of roads, they're intersections of worlds. And sometimes, the things crossing over aren't meant to be seen. Happening number 4, the lone guitar at the crossroads. Crossroads have a reputation for being places where deals are struck, especially in folklore. I always thought those tales were just stories, meant to entertain or scare kids. But after what I experienced one humid summer night, I'm not so sure. It was late July, and I was driving through the south on my way to visit family. The heat was oppressive, even after the sun had gone down, and the air was thick with humidity. I decided to take a shortcut to shave some time off my drive, turning onto an unmarked gravel road that seemed to cut straight through miles of farmland. The road stretched on endlessly, flanked by open fields on both sides. As the hours ticked by, I began to feel the kind of uneasy loneliness that only comes from being so far removed from everything. No lights, no houses, just the dark horizon and the occasional chirp of crickets. Eventually, I came to a crossroads. A single wooden sign stood there, but whatever had been written on it was so weathered that it was illegible. I paused, unsure of which way to go, when I noticed something odd. Sitting at the very center of the crossroads was a man. He was hunched over, strumming a guitar, and completely oblivious to my car's headlights. His appearance was strange. He wore an old, tattered suit that looked like it belonged in the 1930s, and his hair was slicked back in a style that didn't match the modern era. At first, I thought he might be a busker, but what was he doing out here, in the middle of nowhere, at almost midnight? Curiosity got the better of me. I rolled down my window and called out, "Hey, are you okay?" The man didn't respond. He just kept playing, his fingers moving with an unnatural speed over the strings. The melody was haunting, beautiful, but also deeply unsettling, like it was meant to lure you closer. I felt a strange pull to get out of the car and approach him, but something deep inside screamed at me to stay put. Instead, I honked my horn, hoping to get his attention. That's when he stopped playing. He slowly turned his head to look at me, and I'll never forget his face. His eyes were pitch black, like bottomless pits, and his expression was devoid of any emotion. He didn't say a word, but his gaze was enough to freeze me in my seat. Suddenly, the air around me grew heavy, like all the oxygen had been sucked out. The crickets stopped chirping, and an eerie silence enveloped the area. Then, out of nowhere, a low, rumbling laugh echoed through the night. The man stood up, still clutching his guitar, and pointed down one of the roads. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. I didn't wait to figure out what he wanted. I threw the car into reverse, spinning gravel as I backed up, and then sped away in the opposite direction. As I glanced in my rearview mirror, I saw him standing there, illuminated by my taillights, watching me. The melody he had been playing began to echo in my head, growing louder and louder until I thought I was going to lose my mind. It only stopped when I finally reached a well-lit highway. When I told my family about it the next day, my uncle, who's lived in the area his whole life, went pale. He told me stories about the Crossroads guitarist, a spirit said to appear to those at a crossroads, offering them a chance to trade something precious for fame or fortune. I didn't make any deals that night, but the encounter left its mark. Sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, I swear I can still hear that haunting melody. If you ever find yourself at a crossroads and hear the faint strumming of a guitar, do yourself a favor, turn around and leave. Some deals aren't worth the cost. Happening number 5, the whispering winds at the crossroads. The Appalachian region is steeped in folklore, and while I've heard my fair share of ghost stories, I never thought I'd find myself living one. This happened a few years ago when I was visiting a friend in a small mountain town. Late one night, after hours of swapping stories and drinking on their porch, I decided to head back to the cabin I had rented a few miles away. My friend warned me to stick to the main road, but in my slightly tipsy state, I decided to take a shortcut they mentioned offhandedly, a winding path through the woods that cut the drive in half. The gravel road was uneven, flanked by towering trees that blocked out the moonlight. The deeper I drove, the quieter it became. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under my tires. Then I saw it, a crossroads ahead, barely illuminated by my headlights. As I approached, I noticed something strange. The air around the crossroads seemed alive, shifting and moving, though there was no wind. I slowed to a stop at the intersection, unsure of which way to go, when I heard it, a faint whisper. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the car. My first thought was that it was a trick of the wind, but the whisper grew louder, more distinct. It was a voice, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead as I gripped the steering wheel. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The whisper stopped. The silence was deafening, and then, without warning, my car's engine died. The headlights flickered off, plunging me into total darkness. Panic set in as I tried to restart the engine, but it wouldn't even turn over. That's when I saw them. Figures began to emerge from the surrounding woods, their forms shadowy and indistinct. They moved slowly, almost floating, and their heads seemed to tilt unnaturally as they stared at me. I locked the doors and fumbled for my phone, but of course, there was no signal. The figures closed in, circling the car, their features becoming clearer in the dim light of the moon. Their faces were wrong, elongated, with hollow eyes and mouths that seemed to stretch too wide. One of them pressed its face against the driver's side window, and I swear it smiled at me. Its mouth moved, whispering the same incomprehensible words I had heard before. I don't know what came over me, but I slammed my fist against the horn, hoping to scare them off. The sound blared through the night, echoing off the trees. The figures recoiled, their forms shimmering like mist, and then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they vanished. The air returned to normal, and my car's engine roared back to life on its own. I didn't waste a second. I floored the gas and sped away, not caring which road I took as long as it got me away from that cursed crossroads. When I finally reached my cabin, I locked every door and window and stayed awake until the sun came up. The next day, I told my friend what had happened, and their face went pale. They said the locals believe the crossroads are haunted by spirits who try to lure travelers into their world. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't honked the horn that night, and I don't want to find out. All I know is that I'll never take a shortcut through the Appalachian woods again. Some places are better left undisturbed. Crossroads have always been a symbol of choices, paths, and sometimes, danger. The stories shared tonight are a chilling reminder that these places might hold more than just roads. They could be the meeting point for something otherworldly. So, the next time you find yourself alone at a crossroads, think carefully before you linger too long. As always, stay safe, and thanks for listening. Until next time.